You hear the roar first, not the crowd that's already fading, muffled by stone and distance. This is different, closer. The sound of men's voices echoing through corridors you didn't know existed beneath the arena floor. You're being pushed forward, stumbling on steps, slick with something you don't want to identify. The torch ahead casts shadows that dance like demons on walls, carved with names, hundreds of them, scratched deep into the stone by fingernails and broken pottery shards. Some are fresh, some have been worn smooth by time in the hands of women who traced them in the dark, reading the testimonies of those who came before. Your wrists are raw from the rope, your throat is dry from 3 days of minimal water. But it's the knowledge that makes your legs weak, the absolute certainty that what's about to happen has happened before, will happen again, and no one will ever speak of it. If you're drawn to the histories they don't teach, the truths buried beneath the glory of empires. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. It amazes me that these stories find people across the world who are brave enough to hear them. This is Rome at the height of its power, 1st and 2nd century AD, when the Colosseum wasn't just an architectural marvel but a machine designed to demonstrate absolute dominion over conquered peoples. We celebrate Rome's contributions law, engineering, governance, roads that connected continents. But beneath the forums and bathhouses, beneath the marble statues of emperors and the poetry of Ovid, there was another infrastructure, a system so deeply embedded in the mechanics of empire that it operated with the efficiency of tax collection and the regularity of grain shipments. It had procedures, it had documentation, it had training manuals for administrators who needed to know how many, how often, and what to do with the survivors afterward. The gladiatorial games were never just entertainment. They were theater in the truest sense. Staged demonstrations of Rome's power to determine who lived and who died, who was human and who was property, who deserved mercy and who deserved nothing at all. But the games themselves, the combat in the sand under the Mediterranean sun, were only the visible portion. What happened afterward, in the hours between sunset and dawn, in chambers specifically designed for purposes that would never appear in official histories, that was the hidden curriculum. The lesson Rome taught without speaking it aloud. The corridors beneath amphitheaters across the empire, Carthage, Alexandria, Anchiem's, Verona, all shared a particular architectural feature that archaeologists noticed but rarely discussed. Chambers carved deeper than necessary for animal pens or gladiator preparation. Rooms with stone benches built into walls. Ventilation shafts designed not for air circulation, but for sound dampening, engineered so that certain noises would not travel upward to disturb the citizens still lingering in the stands above. When you examine the blueprints of these structures, when you trace the pathways from holding cells to these chambers, when you note the careful placement of oil lamp hooks and the drainage systems built into the floors, the purpose becomes unmistakable. These were not storage rooms. They were not waiting areas. They were built for something else entirely. A fragment of correspondence discovered in the Cairo archives in 1967 contains a single line that stops you cold, written by a Roman administrator to his colleague in Alexandria. Dated to approximately 140 AD, it reads, "Ensure the victory chambers are prepared according to standard protocol. The duration should not exceed 4 hours, as medical attention will be required before transport." The language is bureaucratic, clinical, but what it describes is a system so normalized that the administrator felt no need to elaborate, no need to explain what everyone already understood. The women brought to these chambers came from specific circumstances. They were captured populations, villages that had resisted tax collection, tribes that had shown insufficient deference, communities whose very existence had become inconvenient to local governors seeking to demonstrate their effectiveness to Rome. They were categorized in census records, with phrases like transferred to provincial administration or allocated to public entertainment purposes. These weren't euphemisms designed to hide the truth from officials. They were simply the language of a system where this was routine. Consider the village of Thuburbo-Majus in North Africa, recorded in tax documents until 156 AD that year. The village disappears from all administrative records, not destroyed in battle, not ravaged by plague, simply erased from the census rolls, with the notation population redistributed. 3 months later, the governor of Africa, Proconsularis, held games celebrating the emperor's birthday. The games lasted 6 days. On the final night, according to a private letter written by a merchant who attended, the victors were granted their customary privileges with the usual arrangements. The merchant wrote this casually, the way you might mention that wine was served at dinner. The women from Thuberbomagus, perhaps 20, perhaps 30 of them, would have been transported to Carthage in covered wagons. They would have been examined by a physician, not for their well-being, but to ensure they were healthy enough to be useful. They would have been held in cells beneath the amphitheater for days, fed adequately, kept clean. The Romans understood that certain conditions needed to be met for the system to function as designed. A woman who died from neglect before serving her purpose represented a failure of logistics, and Rome did not tolerate inefficiency. The gladiators themselves occupied a strange position in this machinery. They were slaves, property of the ludus, where they trained. They lived under constant threat of death, their bodies sculpted by violence and discipline into instruments of entertainment. But when they won, when they survived combat and heard the roar of approval from 70,000 voices, they experienced something approaching divinity. For those few moments, they were celebrated, worshipped, transformed from property into heroes. And then the gates closed, the crowds departed, and they were reminded that they were still enslaved except for one thing. One privilege granted to victorious fighters that allowed them to reclaim, briefly, a sense of dominion over someone else's fate. This was the genius of Roman social engineering. By granting enslaved gladiators power over captive women, Rome created a relief valve for the psychological pressure of the games. The gladiators were given a target for their rage and trauma that wasn't Rome itself. They were permitted to dominate others even as they remained dominated. And in that permission, Rome secured their loyalty, because men who have tasted power, even limited and conditional power, will often defend the system that granted it rather than dismantle the system that enslaved them. A training manual for amphitheater administrators, discovered in an Austrian monastery in 1923 and now kept in a private collection in Stockholm, contains detailed instructions how to select women from captured populations, young enough to survive, old enough to understand what was happening. How many to provide per victorious fighter, the ratio calculated based on the significance of the victory and the importance of the games. What medical supplies to have ready: bandages, salves for wounds, herbs that prevented infection. How to document the events without actually documenting them, coded phrases that appeared in official reports. Language that acknowledged something happened without specifying what. The manual's existence is perhaps more damning than its contents. Someone wrote this. Someone taught new administrators how to implement these procedures. Someone standardized the process across multiple amphitheaters, ensuring consistency of practice throughout the empire. This wasn't the action of rogue officials or soldiers acting beyond their authority. This was policy, refined over generations, integrated into the operating procedures of Roman provincial administration. What did the women know as they waited in those cells carved into bedrock? Everything. They knew because the walls told them. Archaeologists, excavating beneath the amphitheater at Putelli in 1954, found something that made them stop work for 3 days. The walls of the holding cells were completely covered in scratches. Names, prayers, messages, some in Latin, learned from guards or other prisoners. Some in languages that took scholars years to identify: Punic, Aramaic, Berber, Celtic dialects from Gaul and Britannia. The messages said the same things in different tongues. I was called Tanit. The gods remember us. My sister, if you can read this, know you are not alone. One inscription, photographed before the site was resealed and the chamber filled with concrete. Read, in careful Latin, they take the body, but they cannot take what lies beneath. The handwriting was steady, deliberate. Someone had spent hours carving these words while waiting for what she knew was coming, choosing to leave a message that might survive, even if she did not. But here's what makes the system truly insidious. It didn't end with that night. The women who survived, who didn't die from injuries or infection, were transported elsewhere. Sold to brothels in port cities, sent to mines in Spain and Dacia, where life expectancy was measured in months, assigned as domestic slaves to households where their history made them especially vulnerable to further abuse. The system extracted value from them again and again, finding ways to exploit their degradation until there was nothing left to take. A papyrus fragment from Egypt, dated to the late 2nd century, lists household inventories for a Roman villa near Alexandria. Among the property, minimal cost. That single line represents a woman whose name was never recorded, whose life before capture is unknown, whose experience in the chambers beneath the amphitheater reduced her to a footnote in someone else's accounting ledger. The academic world has struggled with this history. When German scholar Gerda Müller published her findings in 1967, carefully documented evidence of what she called institutionalized sexual violence as a mechanism of imperial control, the response was ferocious. She was accused of presentism, of importing modern feminist ideology into classical studies, of misreading sources that were clearly about something else. Her work was rejected by major journals. Her colleagues distanced themselves. She died in 1978, having seen her research marginalized and dismissed. But the evidence didn't disappear. It accumulated. Other scholars, mostly women, mostly working at the margins of the field, continued tracing the patterns. They found more letters, more administrative documents, more architectural features that couldn't be explained except as infrastructure for systematic abuse. By the 1990s, the case had become overwhelming. Yet even now, textbooks handle it delicately if they mention it at all. Museum placards describe post-spectacle practices without elaboration. Tour guides walk visitors through amphitheater ruins and point out the animal pens, the gladiator tunnels, the elaborate pulley systems, but they rarely mention the chambers deeper down, the ones with soundproofing and drainage systems. There's a psychological comfort in believing that the worst atrocities are spontaneous, chaotic, the result of individuals losing control. It's harder to accept that they can be systematic, planned, integrated into the functioning of a state. Because if that's possible, if an empire can organize brutality with the same administrative competence it applies to roads and aqueducts, then we have to reckon with darker questions about civilization itself. The fall of Rome didn't happen because of this practice. The empire collapsed for economic reasons, military overextension, political instability. But when the games finally ended, when the amphitheaters fell silent and the administrative machinery ground to a halt, one thing that stopped was this. The women stopped arriving. The chambers fell into disuse. The training manuals were lost or destroyed. And gradually, over centuries, the memory of what happened there faded from public consciousness, not because it was forgotten, but because it was deliberately not remembered. Medieval chroniclers had access to Roman sources we've lost. They read documents that no longer exist, and they made choices about what to preserve and what to omit. When they wrote about Rome's glory, they emphasized law and architecture. When they compiled histories of the games, they focused on gladiatorial combat and exotic animals. The other material, the administrative letters, the architectural specifications, the training protocols, was set aside, considered too disturbing or too damaging to Rome's legacy in the Christian imagination. But Stone remembers, in 2009, Italian archaeologist Margherita Pelosi published a study using ground-penetrating radar at sites across the former empire. At location after location, beneath arenas that tourists visit daily, the same architectural pattern emerged. Chambers 30 feet below the surface, isolated from the main tunnel systems, built with features that served no practical purpose except one. When asked directly what she believed these chambers were used for, Pelosi said, "The architecture speaks clearly to anyone willing to listen. What I cannot do is make people want to hear." The women from Thuba-Bomagus, from Saltus, from dozens of villages, whose names appear in Roman records only in the notation of their disappearance, they left no writings we can read, no accounts in their own words. What survives are scratches on stone, gaps in census records, the careful silence of historians who knew but would not say. And yet they were not nothing. They were not abstractions. They were human beings who understood what was happening to them, who found ways to resist in the only ways available, who left messages for those who came after, even when they knew those messages might never be read. This matters not because dwelling on historical atrocities serves some redemptive purpose. It matters because the patterns repeat, because systems that organize cruelty never announce themselves honestly, because the same language that turned women into allocated resources and assault into customary privileges appears again and again throughout history, in different languages, serving different empires, but always performing the same function, making the unbearable sound administrative, making the systematic sound inevitable. The scratches on the walls beneath the amphitheater at Puteoli are still there, behind the concrete that sealed the chamber in 1954. The maims, the prayers, the messages preserved in darkness because someone decided they were too painful to display. But they exist, they wait, and in their waiting, they pose a question that each generation must answer. Will we look at what was done? Will we call it by its name? Or will we, like the Roman historians and the medieval chroniclers and the modern scholars who resisted this research, find sophisticated reasons to look away. The women whose names were never recorded are still standing in those corridors, waiting for someone to acknowledge what happened to them. Not to save them, that's impossible across 2,000 years, but to witness, to refuse the comfort of forgetting. To understand that the civilization we inherited built its amphitheaters with chambers specifically designed for purposes we'd prefer not to imagine, and in that understanding, perhaps, to recognize the architecture of cruelty when it emerges, again, wearing different names, speaking different languages, but built on the same ancient foundation, the belief that some people are human, and some people are not, and the difference can be enforced in chambers beneath the ground where no one has to watch and no one has to remember. The stones don't forget. The walls still hold the scratches. The evidence remains, waiting in archives and beneath rubble, patient as only truth can be patient. The question was never whether it happened. The question is whether we have the courage to say it did.